Hey everybody, this is Benjamin One. I'm your host. As promised, I told you in the past couple of episodes that I wanted to do a storytelling episode, and this is it. So now that you're tuned in, I got a story for you. I'm gonna try to adjust the volume real quick here. So, for those of you who are tuned in, here we go. This is the storytelling episode that I promised you. In this particular case, I'm going to read you a story that I wrote, and in the end I'll talk about it. So for starters, when I wrote this, about the same time, maybe shortly after, I tried to submit it and get it published, and that never happened. It was what I tried to apply it to was like a hospital-wide, I want to say it's like a literal magazine put on by the staff, and basically they publish poetry and stories by both patients and by the staff that worked there in the hospital. And when I found out about it, I was like, hey, if they're interested, I can send them something that maybe they would want to hear. So I submitted 3 pieces, and as far as I remember, two of them were published, and the third one wasn't. And that's basically the story that I'm gonna read you now, the third story. And I kind of understand why they didn't publish it. It was very personal for me, but I felt like it was a good story and that it was worth sharing. So here we are, the storytelling episode, and I got a couple papers here. In this particular episode, I'm going to read it to you, but in future episodes I might have somebody else telling the story. I might read it to you like this, or I might just tell you off the top of my head. But for this episode, I'm going to read you the story, and then I'm going to talk about it. So here we go. So the title of the story is The Day I Became a Man. So here we go. Do you remember the day you became a man? I do. I remember mine. I was walking up to the house. I had just gotten off the bus from school. I had my backpack on, and I was thinking about the day. The day was just a regular day. I couldn't remember what he was doing in the morning, but when I saw him, I knew what he was doing right then and there. He only ever sat out under the tree alone for one reason. I saw him sitting in his favorite chair under the biggest of the mesquite trees in our yard. I was walking with a pace that would wind an old man, but when I saw him, I stopped cold in my tracks. I had a decision to make. I could act like I hadn't seen him and walk inside the house, or I could acknowledge him and see what happens. This wasn't a first, and it seemed like it would never be the last. I was older then, but I could still remember. The last time I joined him, I was like him for the evening, and that evening ended with me shaking him furiously by the collar and screaming in his face about old wrongs he had done, and old feelings that still burned in me. He was passed out this time, but as I approached and mistakenly kicked some stones, he awoke. There was part of him still there. His training as a soldier would always be with him. Even now, as age was beginning to settle in him and his urges were drowned in spirits, he was still a light sleeper. I wasn't going to join him this time, but I walked up to him and I sat down next to him in the folding chair. I couldn't see the bottle, but I smelled it. There's nothing like that smell in my mind that stirs such memories. They were the kind of memories that take me back to childhood nightmares. I tried to smile when he shifted his eyes from the dirt to mine, and I swallowed hard. I didn't have to ask what the occasion was. He obliged me. He referred to me as his son. He spoke softly in breathy, sweet belches, and he cried. Now I write here, this was the only time he ever cried. He talked about the war. He spoke passionately about being shot in the legs. He could see his friends being blown to pieces. And he remembered coming home only to sign up to go back again. He spoke of the kind of strength it takes to go through all of it. He whimpered as he shot into the trees of the black jungles that I could only imagine. He raised his rifle and he lowered it with sighs and tears. He wouldn't look at me as if to see if I understood, and I nodded on the verge of tears with a growing knot in my throat. He remembered aloud about being a boy with his brother. He spoke about waking up before sunrise. He would be laying on the floor of his mud home. After making a fire, his grandfather would tell them to get the horses as the sun came up. He was alone with his brothers in the desert, relying on one another to bring the horses home. He occasionally smiled like he could still feel the cool desert breeze that would blow over him as they galloped. A lot of time passed before I could ask him, so I did. I asked why he was telling me all of this. I liked the subject matter. Stories of his youth rarely came out, and the opportunity to ask of them was even rarer. But I knew there was something different about this evening, and I wanted to know. He told his son that day that he would soon die. He said, "Take care of your mom. Take care of your sister. They are all you have," he said. "I won't be around anymore to do this," he explained. The tears had finally arrived, and I promised. With all my heart, I promised him, between breaths, to make him proud in the afterlife. He knew that he would soon be going on dialysis, and he was convinced that it was his ticket home. I, too, knew the odds and did not argue about the chances with him. I just promised to be the man that he needed me to be. It's been many years since then. It's been more than a decade, in fact. He never spoke of that day again, and I never asked. It was the day that I said I would be the man, and for once in my youth, I knew that I could. It was the day that I became a man, and it was the day that my old man got to say his piece. I will never have to hear it again, if that time comes. I knew what I had to do, and I know I can do it. Ever since the day I became a man. Okay, so a little background on this story. Yeah, I already said I tried to submit it and get it published, and they didn't, and I really don't argue the fact that they didn't because it was very personal. But right now I'm putting it out now because I've been thinking about it lately, a lot lately, and I could see the path to finishing it. Like, I could see the talk that I would have. So I decided I would read this story and I could talk about it. So this happened, I think I was in middle school. It's a true story. I was maybe even early high school, because the event was nothing new, it was nothing old, it was just something I was used to by then. I came home, and it's happened on more than one occasion. I was going to school down in Babo or somewhere on the res, I'm not sure what time it was. I came home. This happened on a couple of occasions. I even talk about it in the story. There was another time where I came home and I drank with him. But basically I would come home and I would see him, sitting outside. He wasn't inside, he wasn't doing something else. Like, whenever I came home and saw that he wasn't in a regular place, like he wasn't where I normally see him. Be sitting in a chair outside, sitting under the tree, like just outside alone and just with himself. And I'd walk in and be like, oh, I wrote in the story, I knew the score. So I'd come home, I'd see him, and in my mind as a kid, it was like, man, this can, from experience, it can either go good or it can go bad. Sometimes now as an adult I wonder, like, okay, us as his family, we treated him this way, like, alright, hey, if you're drinking, we probably don't want to be around you. Like, we had learned our lesson after so many times of it just, happening and occurring, and we dealing with him, and it was like, alright, we love you, it's our family, but it's a sticky situation when you deal with somebody who's been drinking and you haven't been drinking. Like, it's a situation. I know anybody who has been in this situation, it's like, okay, there's two ways it can go. It can either go good or bad. So you can decide whether or not you want to enter the situation, and that's kind of how this story played out, and it's how it's played out several times. It's like, alright, do I want to interact with him or not? Do I want to interact with him or not? Do I want to go over and see him and see what this is about, or do I want to go inside and be a kid? And on this particular occasion, I went over, and it's like I talked about the smell. If I'm going to talk about anything, it's that smell of sweet beer or sweet alcohol in someone's body, and you can smell it just coming out of all their pores. And me, as someone who has done some drinking, it's like you're not, sometimes you don't even smell it. Like, you can't smell it on yourself, but like, I would come home and smell it and just know what's going on, he's drinking. So this story comes out, like, I wasn't aware of it. My dad's had his own health issues that have come up. Drinking does some heavy duty stuff to your body. And came home, and apparently that day, or recently, and nobody told me except here he is, he's telling me the truth. It had been decided. He had been seeing doctors, and it had been decided, alright, like, I can't remember how long ago that I remember him just having diabetes, but he's always kind of had it as long as I could tell. Like, I remember just seeing him putting shots in his stomach, and this particular time I came home, it turns out it had gone beyond that. It had gotten worse, and it got to the point where they told him, hey, you're gonna have to go on dialysis. And unbeknownst to me, that's what he had to experience. And apparently, at some point, he started drinking. And when I came home that day, there he was, and it was like, I saw him. And there have been times where I had stopped in the past and talked to him, and it didn't work out so well. So, like I said in the story, all right, I have a choice to make. Do I acknowledge him, or do I go inside and act like I didn't, because I know how talks can go with him when he's like that. But I was like, okay, I'm gonna acknowledge him. I'm gonna go over there, see what's up. So, I'm wearing my backpack, and I grab the straps, I pull them close, and I'm like, alright, I'm gonna go over there. I start walking over there, and like, we have a pretty decent sized little yard, and the mesquite trees, they're on the edge of it. Like, our house is in one spot, and a little further off to the edge of the house, there's these big mesquite trees, and he's sitting under there, and that's where, for years, we've done like gardening or whatever, so it's like a nice, comfortable place to be. And it must be that for him, because I came home, and there he is, he's sitting out there, obviously thinking about something heavy, and he had started drinking, and there he was. So I'm walking over, and he wakes up, and we start talking, and sometimes he's either angry or sad, and sometimes both, and sometimes it's so sad like it's hard to watch. So it's happened so many times, we've all become used to it, and we all decide to handle it in our own way. But this time, it's like, alright, let's see what happens. So I went over, and this time he was sad, he was down, and he was like, hey, I'm going on dialysis. Like, he didn't announce it right away, but he was sitting there, and when I first got there, he was talking about the war. And I could tell as he was telling the story, he wasn't sitting there under the tree, he wasn't next to me, he was back there, and he could see it, and he was in it, and when he'd look in different directions, all I could see was our yard, and I could tell, usually when I saw him, and when you can smell that smell, his eyes were bloodshot and like kind of glossy, and it's like I would look into his eyes, and I knew he wasn't in the yard, he was back there. Back there during a time when I was just a little boy, like just a baby boy, and he was gone, and he was out there experiencing these things. And this day he was sitting under that tree, seeing it again, probably, I don't know, thinking about his life. And like I said in the story, when somebody goes on dialysis, it's a huge hit, because it's more prevalent where we live. There's so much, the need for dialysis. There's a ton of people that go on it, and through experience, watching people go and start having dialysis done, it's kind of end of the road stuff, and people die all the time. He knew it, and I knew it. And when he said that to me, he, after he had told his stories, like, he was telling me about the war, and he talked about the day he got shot up, and going back, like, he went back the second time, like he had been drafted in the beginning, he was out there, he experienced it, and then he had the chance to come back. And when he came back, he signed up again. He went back out, and this time he got shot. Like, it got bad enough where he got shot up in his legs. Like, he still has the scars. I'd see him as an old man. He still has the scars on his legs. And he was sitting there talking about it, and I've heard him talk about it sometimes, and sometimes he just cried so much, it was like, alright, I was used to it. But you arrive at a different time and you talk to him. And sometimes you hear the story, sometimes you don't, and you just see him crying. And I'd show up this time. And he told me in dramatic detail what happened and getting shot. And he was sad. And then he moved on to being a kid. And he was with his brother. And I can't remember which brother. It was either, I think it was my Uncle Louie or my Uncle Paul. He was with one of his brothers. And maybe my Uncle Philip. But it was a routine of theirs. Like, I've been with him out into the desert where their house was, and it was his grandparents' house, and it was a mud house. Like, the house isn't even there anymore. There's a mud foundation, like a clay foundation, and we went out there, and I've seen the house, and he talked about his grandfather, his grandmother, and his grandfather raised him, and his grandfather he would be up first, and he'd be up there, making coffee and making a fire, maybe making a fire, and then maybe grandma's out there making the coffee, and then he'd wake them up, and they'd be laying on the ground or on mats, and he'd be like, "Hey, get up," and he'd sing a song or tell them a story. These are things that my dad would tell me. He'd wake them up and tell them, "Hey, it's time to go get the horses or the cattle," and they'd go out, young cowboys, and they would ride out into the desert and go, regather the herd, get the horses, get whatever, bring the water. They'd go out every morning and go running up the mountain, as was tradition to go running. Our tribe was heavy duty and running, and that was part of their deal. He'd wake them up and they'd go running and go riding and do all these things super early in the morning as the sun's coming up. And we're sitting under the tree, and he went back to his youth, and he was talking about riding with his brother, and they'd go out and gather the horses and bring them back. And it was, at the time, it was a story I had never heard. So, that was one thing about making that decision to go acknowledge him, because it was an opportunity to hear, about his past, these stories that I had never heard as a kid. Or maybe as a kid I was too deluded to even ask, but here I was, and I was hearing the stories. And it was exciting to hear both sides, like going to war and being there and talking about being a child and what he did versus what I've done. I've never had a routine of running up a mountain in the morning, but he was telling me about his, and it's really cool to think about it that way, to get, fill in the blank, because I've been on this earth long enough to be alive, how long I've been alive, versus, he was already an adult when I came around, so I've rarely heard of the stories before then, so this was a huge day for me. And so after he had said, "Hey, this was the war, this is what I did as a kid," finally, eventually it came out. I was sitting next to him, and smelling it, whatever. After a while, you don't even care about the smell. You just see your father, this strongest figure in your life, and he's got tears in his eyes, and he's telling me, "Hey, this is my life. This is what I've been thinking about." And then he told me, he's like, "Hey, I found out recently I'm going on dialysis," and that was a strike enough on its own for me to hear. It was like, crap, I knew the odds. I've heard the stories of people going on dialysis, and then just, shortly after you hear, "Oh, this person died," because it was like, it takes it out of you to have your blood ran through a machine that filters it and puts it back in you. It's like you get your blood out and then put it back in, and it's just, I can only imagine it's one of the scariest things in the world is to worry about going and experiencing that. It's like a trip to the dentist. My hands start to sweat. You see it coming. So he told me how he felt. It's like, I'm gonna die. Like, if I go on this, I'm gonna die. And like, what do you do in those moments, especially a kid, like his kid? You try to reassure him, hey, I love you, it's all gonna be okay. But we both knew, both of us knew it was bad. And like I said, like, I took that chance to go talk to him, and I found out this 2 stories that I'd never heard before, and then I talked to him about why he was actually out there drinking that day, and it's because he was afraid of death, afraid of this new unknown thing that he was gonna now have to experience. Like, he had reached that point where he had to go and be part of that. So basically the outcome here is, I want to say it's been something like 12 years since this event happened. So his message was, I want you to take care of your mom, take care of your sister when I am gone. Because eventually, now that I'm gone, Dallas, I'll be dead. And I told him this, and I promised him, it was like a child's promise, but I was like, I knew I could be around, I could be there. Who knows if I could have filled his boots, but I told him, and I promised him. He was drunk, and shaking my hand violently, and we were like, yeah, I understand, leaning on my father, and I could smell that booze, I could smell that sweet booze, and I told him, yes, I promise. I'll be a man. I'll be the man of the house. I'll take care of mom, and I'll take care of my sister. And so the outcome became that he lived a long time. He still lived to this day, and I'm grateful. I'm grateful that I went and talked to him at that point, and I'm grateful that I heard those stories, and I'll tell more of these stories to come, like of his that he told me, and I felt like they were so out there, so something other, like something almost supernatural that made me want to tell him that this is a story that has to be told. And I feel like, hey, anybody who's had this, talk to me. Let's have a discussion about it. This is just one snippet of the experience that's going on the reservation. Hell, around the world, like that's another episode to come that I'm gonna call the Native stigma, the Native American stigma. But what I'm saying is, everybody, not just here, but everybody deals with this in some way or another. Everybody knows somebody who's living this life, and this is recording in my story, like a little storytelling of what I experienced. And what I really wanted to do is get a dialogue going about, alcohol or an addiction, and the mindset that comes from this. Like, I'm telling you this story, and I'm thinking about the smell, and I can smell it now, even though it's not even around me. I can smell it, and I can see this day happening. And I think anybody who's ever experienced it knows the smell I'm talking about, knows what it looks like in somebody they love, and how it feels, and how conflicted you are to deal with somebody who's in the throes of this monster. But at the same time, it's a scary thing, and at the same time it's a human thing. And this is like a recording and a story of my experience with this thing. So I just want to say thank you for tuning in. Not all stories are gonna make you feel the way I feel right now. Like I'm choked up a little, and telling this story is, it's a story close to my heart, but at the same time, like, it's a story that's great. It makes me feel and think hard about life and death and about family and how we're all connected. Like, I do not doubt that someone out there knows this feeling that I'm feeling right now, that knows this story, knows about war and alcohol and pain. And not every story is going to be about this dark side of life, but it will be about life, and I think that's what makes this so interesting and worth sharing. So I'm glad all of you have turned in to hear this episode, and I look forward to telling more stories. And if you guys want to talk about my story or your own stories, I'm all ears. Come on and talk to me. Like, thank you for tuning in. Again, like I told you before, this is your host, Benjamin Wan. I'm probably your cousin, your uncle, your family, your nephew, whatever. I'm glad you guys are listening. And I got many more episodes in mind, so just stay tuned, and thank you for showing up.